the background was actually very adequately presented in the video that Zane took ages ago. We are, I'll say we are, but in a week's, about a month's time, it won't be. It'll be past tense. We were. We're out here in Waiuku, um, roughly halfway between Pukekohe and Waiuku on a 15-acre lifestyle block. And when we took over, when we came out here about 8 years ago, we decided we wanted to make it a bit more than just your standard lifestyle block. So we started growing vegetables, and we designed the property along the lines of permaculture, which will become clear as we go through tonight. I'm going to show you, tonight I'm going to show you very practical, it's very practical for the first part, and the second part's a bit theoretical, because I assume some people know something about permaculture. So I don't want to go into the standard, these are the ethics and these are the principles, da 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 da. So I'll take you through a very practical way of designing a property. And so that's what we did. We've hosted school kids out here, probably around 1,400 school kids. We've taught how to grow vegetables. We've tried all sorts of selling vegetables with market stalls, box schemes, you name it. It's very hard in Waiuku to compete with, well, it's impossible to compete with the supermarkets. The convenience of the supermarket completely trumps the quality of any vegetables that we could produce for most people. There was 2 or 3 customers who stood with us because they had various dietary problems or something like that. So they appreciated the vegetables we grew. But otherwise, people would come and go with amazing regularity, and they just go to the supermarket and buy the stuff there, because you can get your toilet paper, beer, and cigarettes at the supermarket, and obviously you can't get them from us. So that's last year or so we've focused on, or 2 years, about 3 years, we've allowed other growers to come here. So we've divvied up the growing area into about 4 plots. So in our heyday, we had 4 other growers, young people who often find it hard to get land. They could come here and grow. They used our infrastructure, our tools, and if they needed my knowledge. So they grew a variety of crops here. One guy made a business out of it, so he grew for his livelihood. It's a bit sad on him having to leave, but he's winding up at the moment, and he's looking for other land around the place. But it is as it is. He was always aware that the holiday could end when we moved, so it has. We've also, with the help of Lawrence for his permaculture design certificate project, he designed a food forest for us, which we've put in. We've put in about 40 fruit and nut and nitrogen fixers and different types of trees in that. And we've spent the last, about 4 months ago, when we decided to sell the property, we actually fenced it off in the hope that it would make it too hard for somebody to, just to let their cattle through. Because we felt it was a crying shame after putting all that effort into putting in the trees and everything, that the cows would just have a nice breakfast and that would be it. So we fenced it off. Unfortunately, the new owner is going to accept that, and he's looking forward to getting the bananas and the papaya and everything. Well, not papaya, but bananas and the apples and the other fruit that we've got. We have growing, but they're not producing just yet. So that's in a nutshell. My background in permaculture started in Mount Eden 10 years ago, when I helped with Jennifer, my wife. We designed a small garden in Mount Eden, much to the amusement of many passing by neighbors who were completely enthralled by the fact that somebody in Mount Eden, amongst the villa community, were growing vegetables. But yeah, it is what it was quite successful. And then, as I say, when we moved out here, we continued it and did it on a much bigger scale. So what you're going to get, I've taught permaculture design certificate, which is basically the entry level certificate qualification from permaculture. I've taught that in the last year and a half. I've had three cohorts go through the course I've developed. I think it was successful, and the feedback from the students has also been very, very positive. So what I'm going to show you today is actually based on real stuff. It's not your textbook theory, which means that if you have any questions, I really would appreciate you asking them. So just, in fact, just unmute your microphone and chip in. I'll be able to hear you then. I might ask you to type it in the chat if I can't, if I'm busy in the middle of something. But yeah, so as I say, it's practical. The first part, I'm going to take you through the actual design process. So were you ever thinking of doing something either on your lifestyle block or in your urban backyard? You might be able to get some pointers from this. And the second part, which will be a lot shorter, is the ethics and the principles and that type of thing. So to kick off, just let me share the screen. I've called it permaculture for busy people. I'm starting when we move to Ireland, we'll have initial setup period, but I'm planning to do an online course, a modular course for busy people. So it'll be a very focused and concentrated course. And what you're seeing today is, if you like, the first version of what I will be producing in a much bigger scale. But I've permaculture for busy people, because the idea is that you can do permaculture for lazy people and take 2 years to do it, or you can take permaculture for smart people and go into the theory and the practice and everything else. But I reckon permaculture for busy people is what it's about. So you're busy, you haven't got a lot of time, you're looking for immediate solutions, or at least for pointers in the direction as to where you can find your solutions. I'm going to take you through the three basics of designing in permaculture. One of them is drawing the base map. We'll go into some info about how to draw a base map, and then the zones, which are zones where you place things, and sectors. I'll actually do it in a different order. I'll do base map, sectors, and zones. And sectors are the things that affect your design. So, and then I'm going to introduce the ethics and design principles, and I'll answer any questions you may have. And for me, permaculture is not about sustainability. It's about a journey to resilience, or in resilience. It's about creating an environment whereby you help people, people help you, you help yourself, and so on. Well, actually, there probably isn't any other combination, is there? So what is permaculture design? And I'm sorry, it's a busy slide. It's about the primary thing is about observation of natural systems and how they sustain themselves. I mean, nature's been around since basically the first lizard crawled out of the ocean, or depending on whatever way you believe it. But nature's been around for many millennia and longer. And it's still around, and it will be around when we're no longer around. I mean, nature is just one of those things. It knows how to take care of itself. The leaves fall from the trees, they provide nutrients, and so on and so on. So permaculture is primarily about observing those natural systems and trying to understand how they maintain themselves, and then applying those natural principles to the design of farms, gardens, buildings, woodlands, communities, you name it. So that's the basic premise of permaculture design. A couple of things. It's about being productive for less effort. So it's reaping the benefits of our environment now and into the future. So it's the standard North American Indian proverb: we borrow the land from the next generation. You know, we don't give them our land, we borrow it from them to do with what we want, and so on. So it's if you're putting a lot of effort into your permaculture property or into your permaculture result, then you've done it wrongly. It's about Bill Mollison, who coined the term permaculture, used to call it hammock time. In other words, sitting in a hammock with a beer, looking out and watching what was happening. And obviously, sometimes you have to intervene, and we'll talk about that. So it works in harmony with nature. One of the main things, it's not a dogma or a religion. There's quite a lot of misunderstanding I feel about permaculture. It's almost as if it's, who's the deity in permaculture? Well, permaculture is it's not a dogma. There's no fixed rules apart from natural rules, and you learn those by observing them. And it's not a religion. Not all of us knit our own underwear. Some do, but not all of us do that. It's not a religion. Does it help find solutions for many of the problems facing us? Indeed, it does. Will it help solve the world? Solve the world? No, but it's an important contribution to that. It encourages us to be resourceful and self-reliant. All the systems, we try and create closed systems so that there's no waste and that type of thing. And at the fundamental, at the basic, at the ethics of this, really the building stones are care of the earth. In other words, if you take care of the earth, it'll take care of you. Care of people, so take care of next generation and previous generations. And one thing I find really important if you're trying to create a resilient community is distributing the what's called the fair share or the profits. For example, if you grow well under using permaculture principles, you should have an abundance. Well, you can do many things with that abundance. You can make compost out of it. You can give it to your friends, or you can give it to the local community, or whatever. So for me, that's the distribution of fair share. And in doing that, you're creating a very positive contribution to the wellness of your community. So how do you start with your design? Well, step one is to grab yourself a base map. So this is an example of Google Maps or Google Earth. Sometimes Google Earth is better. They've got newer maps. Sometimes Google Maps is sufficient. But if we take this, you probably can see my cursor. If we take this little field here and say we wanted to do a permaculture design for that, then you just section that out on your Google Maps, and you'd blow it up. It gets a bit blurry, but it's fine for a design process. So so you create your base map. If it's for a city, then you'd obviously outline your house and pull that out. So that's the base map. Another way of creating a base map is to use, in Auckland, where we've got a very good council GIS system. You've got the address there at the bottom. And in that GIS system, you can identify your property. It draws it with a nice blue line around it, which shows you what your property. This is our property, by the way, in Waiuku. It draws it around, and you can switch off different layers. In this particular one, I've got the contours switched on. I think they're, what are they, 1 meter contours. And so that when you switch on the contours, if you remember your geography, you can actually get a lot of information. For example, there's where the contours are spiky. There's a ridge, and where they're bent backwards, if you like, there's a valley. So you can see these. And if you go out, if you were to stand on our deck and look out, you'd see that ridge, and you'd see that valley, and you'd see that valley. And certainly, end of the winter, when the soil is waterlogged and the water's starting to pool, then when there's heavy rain, you will actually notice that those valleys will be definitely wetter than the ridges and everything else. And in this case, the steep line, the lines close together, like the isobars on a weather map, they show that there's a steep gradient there. There's quite a steep gradient on parts of our property. So much so that we can't do any terracing or anything like that. We can put in swales, but they're more than likely going to wash out. So on this slopey bit here to the north of the house, there's not an awful lot we can do to grow on it. But indeed, we haven't grown on that. But okay, so that's how you start off with your base map, and as I say, you can switch on the various layers. Contours is probably the best one to see where things are. With the advent of drones are becoming quite they're quite an amazing piece of technology. They allow you to do other things, like, for example, here we in the PDC, the design certificate course, we laid out the contours using an A-frame. Just stepped an A-frame across the field, and then an A-frame identifies points of equal height. So we'd stick a standard or a marker in at each point of equal height. And then I got out the mower and I mowed along the contour lines like that. And then 3 or 4 days later, this was at the start of the summer, 3 or 4 days later, the sun had dried the grass that I'd mown. And when I put up the drone, I got a very clear picture of the contours. So that's another, you can use drones for that. You can actually, I've done it for a couple of neighbors. I've flown the drone over their property, and I've made you can get what are called ortho photos, which are high resolution pictures from the drone. You can use some software, which is mentioned there. You can stitch them all together. And again, one of the features of that software is that you can actually identify the contours. It's not as accurate as the council contours, because if there's a tree, the drone picture sees the tree. So all of a sudden you get a 30-meter high contour there, or 20-meter high contour. But it's good if the ground is flat, and certainly if the grass has been eaten down by cows or mown or something like that, it's quite a good way of finding it. And there's also the satellites. There's three main commercial groups that offer high resolution pictures, which will have contours in them. And of course, you can use pen and paper and some of the instruments you see below, like a theodolite and a measuring stick and so on. You can do it. And if it's in your own backyard, then you probably will use something like an old water level, which it basically is a translucent pipe that you fill with water, and then each end of the pipe is always going to be the same height, so you can measure. You can walk around your backyard measuring that. But for larger properties, you tend to go satellite or drone or the council website. So you have your base map. The next thing to do is to try and understand the factors that are affecting your property. So things like where the wind is blowing from, where does it consistently blow from, where does the storm wind blow from, where does the trade wind blow from, and where do the outliers blow from. And again, NIWA has got wind maps for an awful lot of the country. You just have to go onto the NIWA website, and I think it's under climate, and you'll find a report which will give you maps for various parts of the country. We're very fortunate here in Pukekohe because of the fact that there's a lot of growing done here. So NIWA has got quite a lot of information about the weather, the rains, and so on for this particular area. But it's around for most of New Zealand. So what you're trying to do is to understand the natural factors that affect the land or the productivity of the land. So you're looking for where does the strong wind blow, or where does the consistent wind, the trade wind blow, and where do the storms come from? Because you want to protect yourself from those winds. And you're also, by also understanding what's happening affecting your area, you can then start to build in resilience. So you can make sure that you can handle extreme weather conditions. So you can put in a ditch or a drain or something, which may for 5 or 6 years never be used, but certainly the 1 year that it hoses down nonstop for 2 months, like it did a couple of years ago, you can be rest assured that the rest of the land is not going to become too boggy, because the drain is going to lead the water where you want it to go. Wind and water are the two primary factors that you need to get a good handle on before you start placing things on the ground and everything else. They're the ones, the water in particular is going to destroy. It washes soil away, it washes plants away. It can do no end of damage. The wind tends just to blow things over, which, if it's a tree, you chop it up and use it as in the compost or something. But water can do a lot more damage. So it's really good to get an understanding of where the wind and the water come. And then obviously there's the sun. We need to understand in the winter, the sun in the southern hemisphere, it always rises in the east, and in the winter it goes up there's a low trajectory for it, and it'll settle in the west, a bit north of between west and northwest, and it'll rise between east and northeast. And then in the summer we get an awful lot more sun. It rises a lot earlier, and it rises somewhere down around the southeast, and it'll go higher in the sky and settle itself down in somewhere in the southwest. So we've got to by understanding how the sun flows across the property, we can actually identify trees that might cause a problem with their shadow, and we can use that shadow to our advantage. You might want to use the shadow of a tree to be able to enable yourself to grow some shade-loving vegetables, for example, lettuce or coriander or something like that. But typically, you'll want to know where the sun rises and where the sun sets. Orientation of a greenhouse, you set it usually north-south with a bit of a lean towards the east, because you want to get the early morning sun to shine into the greenhouse to burn off any dampness that remains there from the nighttime. So if you oriented it slightly towards the, say, northeast, then you're going to present much more of the side to the sun, which will get more sun into it. But yeah, these are the nuances and knowing exactly where your sun rises and where it sets will allow you to apply those nuances. And they all make a difference over time. I mean, we're talking about maximizing what we get from nature, and by orienting the greenhouse even 10 degrees, you can actually get more bounty or more crops from it. See, of course, it may not be possible on your land. You might have a small plot where you have just a big wall or something like that. But if you have the freedom to do it, then it's worth taking factors like that into account. It's less important the more. Here in Auckland, we're on the cusp of when it becomes important to do that. At 51 degrees, it's not all that important. And certainly as we go higher in New Zealand, it's less important. As we go more to the south in New Zealand, it becomes more relevant. So this is the wind I was telling you about. This is from the NIWA Auckland climate, which is based on climate is statistics that NIWA has kept for the last 40 to 60 years. So it's an average of winds. So you can see in our case that we have pretty well the southwesterly is the trade wind. That's where the majority of the wind comes from. And then northeasterly and occasionally from the southeasterly. And where we are on our property, the southeasterly doesn't play a role because there's a hill behind us in the southeasterly direction. So we don't get much wind coming from that way. But certainly the northeast, we get our storm winds coming from. And the southwest pretty well sets up about 10 o'clock in the morning in the summer, and it lasts through till probably around 5 or 6 in the evening, and then it'll settle back to whatever the prevailing wind, whatever the wind is, if you like, the wind being caused by the climate, the weather conditions. But we can count on a southwesterly wind, and if it's supported by the weather, then it'll be a strong one. If it's not supported by the weather, then it'll be a bit weaker. But it'll be there every single day in the summer, and you can count on that. Which means we can plan our crops accordingly by putting tall crops on the southwest of our beds and putting shorter crops to the north, which means that the tall crops are going to protect the shorter crops from the wind and so on. So that's this country's got a very good soil map. Landcare Research have done a remarkable job on identifying different soil structures. And when we look at our soil structure, I put in the 3 darts there. There's 3 different types of soils on our property. There's 2 different types. The northern type is a free draining soil, which we didn't know about until I looked at this. but it's that's where you can actually grow in the northern part of our property. It's on a lower paddock. You can actually grow there without the use of water because the water, the soil is very friable, and with proper tillage, you can actually, using osmosis, you can bring the water up to the surface. So when you plant your, if you till very shallowly just before you plant, then the soil, the water will wick up to the surface, and your seedlings will survive. Where we're higher up the hill, where we grow up here, you've got to result to the traditional put the seedling in water for the first 3 days, then water for every third day after that, and so on. It'll be different for whatever. And of course, if you're in a city environment, an urban environment, then it's probably not going to apply anymore, because the first thing developers do is they rip off all the topsoil, pile it in a corner, put the houses on, and then put back as little of the topsoil as possible. So in a city environment, you're probably not going to have any use for this, but in an urban environment, it certainly applies. So there's other sectors involved. There's where the water flows on the property. In our case, it flows down the hill from the neighbours. We're certified organic, so we can't actually allow that water from the neighbours to spread too far onto our property. So we've dug a drain the whole way along the boundary, so the water flows off the neighbours into the drain. It flows down the drain into a pond. We've dug a small pond where the water will slow down. And if you remember, slowing water drops whatever it's carrying. So it drops it in the pond, and then the pond will overflow and travel through another drain down towards the big stream at the bottom of the property. So you can't, you'll never stop water, but what you can do is get it to behave the way you want it to behave. And that water flow has proven itself in the big weather events that we've had. We've had very little water flowing onto the garden beds and doing damage. It's basically flowed where we wanted it to flow. Um, Fire is another sector that you may have importance for. In our case, we've got that big slope in front of the house, and the fire travels uphill about 4 times faster than it travels downhill. So there's a train, one of the Glenbrook Vintage Railway, they've got a steam locomotive that chugs its way along the valley at the bottom. If that spark was to ignite, some would say the grass on the side of the track, and sufficiently that the wind would blow that across to us, then we'd have very little time to protect ourselves, because it would come hoon its way up the hill faster than we could probably do something about it. So yeah, what does that mean? It means in a dry summer, I make sure there's a fire break cut at the top of the hill. I get the tractor with the flail mower, and I drive around a couple of times and make about a 10-meter fire break at the top of the hill. So hopefully that will give us time to rescue our passports and whatever else before it jumps across the fire break and continues. We're on the top of a hill. We're 55 meters above sea level. So we get a lot of noise from the valley. Dogs barking, kids playing in the swimming pool, traffic every morning, 6 o'clock, the Waiuku to Auckland traffic starts up, and again at 4 o'clock in the evening when they're coming home. So we get noise. We get noise from the train. That's the upside is that we have a most magnificent view from our property over the valley, and so on. But the noise is there, so yeah, we can take that into account. And certainly in an urban environment, noise is a very important one to recognize. You might have noisy neighbors, you might have railways, you might have whatever, airplanes flying overhead. There's not a lot you can do about them, but the others you can certainly do something about by planting trees or whatever. Then other sectors include pollution, the view, beauty, a very important aspect, and whatever other hazards there may be pertaining to the property that you're trying to design for. So yeah, Are there any questions at this stage? I see not everybody's gone home. That's good.
I just I've got a comment, not a question. Just when you're talking about water, I was at the Earth Song Eco Village in Ranui the other day,
Yep.
and I was asking them how they coped in the floods and the Cyclone Gabriel, because I know that Ranui was really badly flooded, and they said they didn't get any flooding at all because they've used permaculture design in their design. So they have a massive drain, and they also have a lot of sort of areas where water can flow down into reservoirs. So I thought that was interesting because I know that Ranui is really badly hit.
Yeah, we had forget his Tony from Ranui. He came to our PDC he started off with our PDC for 3 or 4 sessions before he had to leave to take care of his child. But he told us that as well. One of the main reasons they had was because they planned out where the water would go, but they had big ponds that the water could fill up before it caused any damage. And the ponds were good for about 3 days of rainfall. They filled after one day in the height of the storm, but that was sufficient to stop the water overflowing anywhere where it wasn't required. And I noticed actually that Auckland Council is adopting that principle as well with a number of the new subdivisions. They're requesting that the developers put in these drainage ponds. And of course, the big question that's being raised then is, well, should we fence them off? Well, there's not an awful lot of point in fencing off something that's going to grow flowers for, hopefully forever, but only when there's a big rainfall will it actually kick in and be good. But that's the main issue. That's actually stalling council's development of that very sound principle. Should we put a swimming pool fence around it? Well, yeah, you probably gather from my attitude, you know where I'm standing that. Okay, so now we've got one more aspect to consider when we come to design. So we've looked at all these, and so I mentioned contours straight away. They're maps, they're lines of equal height, and they are a very important part of permaculture design. They're one of the ladies on the recent course, she maintained that her 1 acre section was flat. And I told her that it wasn't. There was a drop. So anyhow, her husband is a drain layer and he came home with the laser level and they measured it out. And she came in with her kind of like quite contrite saying, Rory, you were right. There is actually a 1 meter drop across our section. Well, there is a drop, and that's the important thing. So, one edge or one side or one part of it is lower than the other. So that's where the water is going to end up. And you can take that into account when you're designing whatever it is you want to design in that property. So she realized that, I understand. So that's where I put my bananas. Yes, Heather, that's where you put your bananas. Great. So the contours on a bigger scale can show valleys, they can show ridges. Even without walking the property, you can actually see these. And the other important thing is they can suggest microclimates. So if you've got for example, like we have a southwesterly trade wind that comes through, and we have a gap in our contours which shows that on the northeast side that's quite low, and it's protected by a hill or something like that. We can be quite sure that that's going to be a microclimate. It'll be getting the northern sun. It won't have the wind blowing through it to keep it cool, so it'll be a warmer microclimate. And likewise, there'll be microclimates where you say, well, that's actually going to be a colder. So I can put my cold loving crops or trees or whatever in there, and I can put my warm loving trees or crops in there, and you can create microclimates. I mean, you can build earth mounds. You can do things like that to create the microclimates. And we've got a beautiful one at the end of the house. We've got a brick house, and the end, which is the west end, gets the sun for a large part of the day. And of course, at nighttime, when the sun goes down, the bricks start to radiate the heat back. So we'd probably have about a 2 or 3 degree difference in climate between that and somewhere out in the paddocks. That's sufficient to allow us to grow. We had tamarillos there. We had the frost sensitive ones, because it never freezes there. We've got a lovely mandarin tree growing there that doesn't get any frost, so it works fine, and so on. So you're looking for you're looking for your microclimates. So yeah, I've shown you that one before. I won't go into. That's just an A-frame on the left. It's called an A-frame because it's an A, and each leg is more or less the same length. You hang a bob in the middle, and then you walk that across the land, making sure that the bob stays in the middle, and then each leg is going to be of an equal height. They're reasonably accurate, and you can make it out of anything. If you've got 3 bamboo poles, or 3 iron bars, or 3 pieces of very finely cut teak or something like that, you can make an A-frame out of it. So step 3 now, we're moving into the zones aspect. So we've got the base map, we've got the sectors, so we've got the things that affect our growing or our living or our being on the property, and now we move into zones. Zones is a concept that was developed, that was identified in Austria, where people, a geographer in Austria looked at the way that the Austrians had set up their society, and he saw that people would work and congregate together. So that was zone 0. That's where they live. And then zone 1, he recognized, was an area around that, and that people used to go more frequently. In Ireland, it'd obviously be the pub, but yes, so it's where they go more frequently. In a permaculture idea, that would be where you have your orchard, that would be where you have your kitchen garden, that would be where you have your herbs, wherever you're growing your herbs. That would be so they go there. Your chickens, for example, they'd be in your zone 1. They're things that you do every day, and irrespective, you go out there. And what you try to do then is you try to combine those things you do frequently together in that zone. But obviously you have to have compatibility there, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so zone 2 is less frequently. In our case, that'll be the food forest. We don't go there. Go there every day, maybe every couple of days, to maybe do some slight bit of maintenance until it becomes self-maintaining. Zone 3 would be our paddocks, where our cows would graze. We'd hardly ever go there. We might look over the fence at them, or we might stand on the step and have a look out to see that they're not that they're still there, mainly because they haven't gone to the neighbors. But we'd seldom visit that. We might visit if one of the cows were crying out, crying for attention. We might go and see that their trough was still full of water or something like that. But it's a very infrequent area that we'll go. Zone 4 is a special grow zone, and that's where you will grow your timber and long-term tree crops. So your walnuts, your chestnuts, that type of tree crop, your macadamias, and obviously your timber. You might have your coppiced willow there, or your coppiced whatever it is you're using for your kindling or something like that. And then outside that, which is usually quite far away, would be your undisturbed natural environment, zone 5. And that's where nature is doing its own thing. So that's where you would go to study nature. So and in our case, we have a zone 5, but we actually go there and we remove the pest weeds, the flammable weed, and most of the privet we try and keep away. Because if we don't do that, then the birds will bring the seeds into our growing areas, and we'll end up with mini privets all over the place. But normally it would be an undisturbed natural environment where you go to study nature, and you can actually do that in a urban backyard. You can have a corner of your backyard where you actually don't go, where you've got no need to go. and that'll be where you can go and study how the wet are doing, or how the whatever the spiders are doing, and so on. You can look at it there. So they're the zones, and as I said, zone 1 is you at this stage in your design you do what's called a paste analysis. So you identify and you think of all the plants that you want. So both vegetables and your flowers and whatever else. And you just make a list of them. And you may not have them on the property, that's fine, but you make a list of the ones you want. We want some pollinators, we want borage, we want calendula. I want to be able to do such and such, so we need that. And then you make the A stands for animals. So then you make a list of the animals that you want on your property. So in our case, it was chickens and cows. In a neighbor's case, it was pigs. You had some sheep as well. So you make a list of those animals. And then you make a list of the structures you have available or that you would consider building. So garden sheds, paths. If you want to put a swale in, a swale is basically a hump of earth to keep water away or to keep water in, something like that. So you might decide what you want. And they always used to say that it's not a permaculture property unless you've got a swale and a herb spiral. Well, in Auckland, swales are probably not the best idea in many circumstances, because with the soil, with the small layer of topsoil and the clay understory, it's very easy to put a swale in to find it at the bottom of the hill in the first load of rain, because it lifts the swale up and slides it down the clay. So structures. And then what tools and resources you have available, money being one of them. How much money do you have? How much time do you have available? What tools do you have at your disposal? Are they all manual? Have you got a 3.5 ton digger? What tools have you got? And then any events. Events for me are things like I want to be able to show people my garden. I want to be able to go to market. I want to be able to hold my birthdays. When we were doing I did a market garden for Manurewa High School, and one of the things that was when we did the interviews for the children, they wanted a safe place to be. That was very high on their list of wants. They wanted marijuana as well, but mainly it was they wanted a safe place to be. So then you group these in terms of zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. In other words, what you do regularly, what you'll do less frequently, what you'll do occasionally, and so on. So your chickens, your children's spaces, your composting, your herbs, your greenhouse, herb garden, so on and so on, they'd all be in zone 1. Then in zone 2, you'd have your aquaculture. If you had that, you'd have your bees, your ponds, your rain tanks, your seating and seedlings and that type of thing, and so on with zone 3, 4. Zone 5 is easy because that's just where nature does its thing. So you don't actually have to say, I want such and such in there, because it's actually what nature decides to put in there that you do that. Now you put them all in a spreadsheet. You work out what compatibility there are between things. So, and also incompatibility. For example, chickens and worm farms don't go very well together. Chickens obviously have a different idea behind that, and the worms, however, don't really like it. So you keep them apart, unless of course you want to use your worm farm to feed your chickens, in which case they'd be compatible and you put them in the left-hand side. So you might want your compost and your vegetable plot to be close together, so that you take the bad leaves off the vegetables and chuck them straight in the compost. There is obviously an issue there if your compost attracts rats, because rats and vegetables go very well together as well. So you might like to have your compost further away. We have gone through 3 iterations here with our compost pile. The first one was we put it probably 20 meters down a hill from the vegetables, a bit far from the house, because we didn't want any odor coming into the house. But that proved to be stupid, because all the water went down the hill, and in the winter we couldn't get to the compost. So then we moved it up towards the vegetables, and that was also very stupid, because the rats went and lived in the compost and would come out at night and devour our vegetables. So then we moved it about 100 meters away from the vegetables, and the issue with the pressure from the pests was a lot less. So yeah, so then you do that, and then you can, if the nerds amongst us do something like this, where you use a spreadsheet and you color code the combinations. So children's spaces and culinary and medicinal herbs are green because they go well together, and culinary and medicinal herbs and chickens don't go well together, so they're red. And the yellows are the ones that you don't really mind too much about. So the greenhouse and the worm farm, for example, would be something that you didn't really worry about. So and then you shuffle them all around until you get them all together, and so on. And that then determines where in your zone one you put the things together and the things you have to keep apart in your zone one, and likewise zone two and zone three. It does work. We use it for design. It takes a bit of working around, but if you're flexible, if you're used to a spreadsheet, then it's actually quite a good way of doing it. So this is our property. It's a rural 15-acre property. It would normally stand upright, but you can't see it on a slide because it cuts the head and the tail off. But we have our zone 0, which is our house, zone 1, which is our orchard, our growing area, and our barn, because we go to the barn pretty well every day. So that's our zone 1. Zone 2 is our food forest. Zone 3 is the light green, and there's where the cows run around. Zone 4 is the area where we have some coppicing in here, so we gather, if we had a fire, we'd collect the firewood from here. And this is another stream area down here where we've planted some pioneer plants to try and shade out the gorse. We may be a bit optimistic, but hopefully the manuka and the other pioneer species we've put in there, the flax harikari is certainly doing a good job of starting to, and it also has the advantage of shading the stream, so we don't get as much weed growing in the stream, which means that in the winter, when the rain starts and it comes hooning down towards that stream, it actually doesn't clog up in the stream. It flows straight through and gives the neighbor the problem that we would have otherwise. That's the theory behind it. So that's on a big scale, and there's right at the southern end and right at the northern end, we've got our zone 5. At the southern end, where I've got the cursor now, that is a buffer zone between us and the cropper here, which is probably, so it's about a 15-meter gap of just literally wilderness. We never go there. Jennifer goes there occasionally if she sees some tobacco weed or something she wants to pull out, and sometimes we might have a go at the privet, but normally we just leave it do its thing there. And over here is by another stream, and we don't go there. It's actually too slippy, end up in the stream. On a smaller urban property, this is from one of the people who did the course. There's the house. Close to the house is the parking, patios, paths, and so on. Further away is the food forest and the veggies. Further again are the less intensive areas. So zone 3, the purple, they're the less intensive areas. And you can see even here there's a contour. That's the 9 contour. There again, this will be 8. So there's obviously a lower bit there. They've put the house on the higher bit, which makes sense. And then, so this was the design that one of the people on the course did for their, I think it was for their mother's place. So they worked out the zones. In an urban environment, it's sometimes a bit artificial. For example, you could suggest that, this is it's a bit artificial having a zone 4, but yeah, it shows that it's possible. That's probably a quarter acre or half acre section. So yeah, so now you've got to the stage where you've got your design pretty well done. How do you implement it? There's certainly a sequence that you'd follow to implement. You do your earthworks first, your structure. So if you're on a farm and you want to put a pond in, or you're going to raise up a a bund or something like that, then you do that first, and then you do your structures. So you do those, you put those in, and then you create your paths and your access way. And then you check your water flow and maybe add a drain, 2, 3, whatever number of drains, or perhaps build a swale if you hadn't got a steep slope and you could put a stable swale in, then you'd do that. The next thing you do is start with your food forest. I mean, obviously you can grow your vegetables as well as if you want to, but the sequence should be put in your food forest. So you identify your trees, you identify if you have them and you move them, or you run along to the nursery and you buy them, or you go to the tree crop sale in the botanical gardens and purchase them, or whatever. So you kick off your food forest. At some stage you'll need soil. So probably the fifth or sixth thing to do is a good thing to start establishing your composting system, worm bins, hot compost, whatever you decided to do. Then you can start creating your microclimates by putting rocks and structures in strategic places on the property to create shade, to create reflection. If you were going to put a pond in, then now would be the time you'd do that. Or probably you do that a lot earlier, do that by A. But your pond actually can create quite a nice microclimate with the reflecting light and the direct light. Then you move existing items, which is preferable. If you've got them already in your property, then you'd move them around if that makes sense, or you can buy them where required. If you need herbs, you build a herb spiral. If you want to grow veg, then you put them in depending on the season and so on, and the number of them depending on the space and your need for them. Don't forget that you're trying to create an abundance that you can share with others. So, and then I just want to mention gills. The idea of permaculture is to do as much with as little as possible. So if you have a square meter or whatever, an area where you haven't got much in it, you could consider stacking your stuff vertically. So you could have a ground cover of chamomile, or you could have a root underneath that of kumara and potatoes or whatever. You could have a fruit above that. You could have maybe a berry, and above that again you could have maybe a fruit or a nut tree, and you could have a vine climbing up the nut tree. So in that, if you like, that maybe 3 square meters, you've got 3 or 4, maybe 5 different food production types. That's called vertical stacking, and it's a very good way of getting the most bang for your buck. Because you could have your yams, you could have your kumara, you could have your potatoes, you could have and so on, as I just mentioned. They're called gills, and that vertical stacking. It's a very important concept in permaculture. We when we're doing a design or whether we're doing an implementation, we're looking for opportunities to create as many vertical stacks as possible, because that means we're going to get the most out of our limited area. So that's the first bit. I hope it's been 3/4 of an hour chatting about bits and pieces. There's obviously it's just scratching the surface, but hopefully it's giving you an idea that if you do want to even research it further, it's giving you a structure. Start with the base map, work out what the sectors are, decide your zones, put your stuff to do your paste analysis to find out what it is you want, put it all together, put it into the zones, implement it in stages. So now I'd like to give you a bit more of a background as to what permaculture is. It stands for permanent agriculture, but in the modern understanding, it's actually become permanent culture, because the design principles that I'll show you in a minute actually apply to a lot more than agriculture, horticulture, or whatever. They apply also to the way society can be put together. So in 1975, it was kicked off by a guy called Bill Mollison. He'd done a lot of traveling. He'd looked at the way indigenous people had survived for the thousands of years that they've survived. He identified the systems they had put in place to enable them to survive. And he recognized in a lot of the indigenous system, South America, North America, Africa, New Zealand, Tasmania, Australia, that there was a lot of commonality between the way they did things, which allowed them to survive for so many years. So he identified those, and he put the modern slant on it, and he called it permaculture, and he started teaching it. That was in 1975. The first PDC in New Zealand was in 1984. It was given up in the Kaiwaka, and some of the current gurus in New Zealand went to that. But today, permaculture is all over the place. It's spread throughout the world. There's if you look on the international permaculture press, there's PDCs held in the most unusual places. You know, the jungles of Nicaragua through to the hills in the Andes. It's pretty well a universal universal method, and it still relies on the same principles that Bill Mollison developed. David Holmgren, you can't ignore his work either. He's taken a lot of Mollison's teaching and made it much more tangible and much more real. He was a student of Mollison to start with, and the two of them formed a really good partnership and developed it. That's the manual on the side. It is a designer's manual. It's not bedtime reading, but it does have a lot of excellent information in it. And even though it may be 40 years old, a lot of the information in it is still relevant today. If you take it and put the modern slant on it. I mean, it doesn't mention solar panels, obviously, but it does talk about dehydrating using the power of the sun and so on. So the philosophy is working with rather than against nature. So it's about integrating the landscape with people, or people into the landscape in a sustainable way. It relies on observation. Mollison used to say thoughtful observation rather than thoughtless labor. It's a design system for resilient living. As I say, if you start sharing your bounty and your abundance with others, you'll find that they will share their abundance and bounty with you. And you're starting then to create a connection between the community, which serves really well in times of strife. Permaculture is about maximizing energy, the storage, the use, and where possible, the reuse. So that means, for example, you store energy as high up in the hill as you can. So you have your pond as high up as you can, because then you can let the water down to another pond and let the water down to another pond. Whereas if you only store the water at the pond at the bottom, then you actually have to pump it up using energy to get it anywhere up the hill. So that's there's a Seth Holzer in Austria has got a very good example of how he stores energy at the different stages throughout the side of the mountain that he lives on. One of the ones you'll hear an awful lot in permaculture is the problem is the solution. If you have a problem, then explore the problem, and you'll probably, my experience is that somewhere in the problem is the solution. Maybe not to that problem, maybe to a different problem that you'd given up on trying to find the solution, but often the problem is the solution. And the bottom principle, make the least change for the greatest effect. So stop, observe, look, think, and then decide, I think I'll do that. The least change for the greatest effect. Now, the three ethics are, I've mentioned them before, is care of the earth, care of people, and the distribution of fair share. And these are the 12 principles that David Holmgren distilled out of the work of Bill Mollison. I'm not going to go into every one of them, but I will name them because they are important. The symbols attached to them do have some relevance. For example, number 9 on the left there, use small and slow solutions. And there's the snail. And so the primary one is observe and interact, and then catch and store energy. So when you're doing these are design principles. So they're the principles that you follow when you're doing a permaculture design. So the principle 1, you observe and you interact. In other words, you look and then you try something and you see how it went. and so on. Then you catch and store energy. That's the second principle. And as I said, you catch it as high up in the hill as possible. So if you're storing water or any form of energy, you store it up as high, because then you can use it at different levels coming down. Obtaining a yield. Well, we're getting the sun, we're getting the wind, and we're getting the rain for free. Usually we have the nutrients in the soil for free. So why would you do it if you're not going to obtain a yield? Permaculture is it's not a hobby. It's designed to produce something. So obtain a yield. And then there's apply self-regulation and accept feedback. Only the arrogant ever assume that they know it all. And certainly if you're moving on to a property from somewhere else, just have a chat with the people next door, and or invite them onto your property and show them what you've done and accept their feedback. You may not do anything with it, but there may be something of great value in their feedback. And then it use and value renewable resources and services. Not only use and value them, but try and create renewable resources. Produce no waste, another very important one in permaculture terms. And that often links into the problem is a solution, because if you have a problem with waste, the solution may well be in the way you're handling the waste or the way you're creating the waste. You can get rid of the problem by applying a solution. But in principle, you produce no waste in the permaculture environment. You start small and then go big. So it's trial and error is probably the more modern way of saying it, but you design from pattern to detail. In other words, you look at the pattern, the great big picture, and then you go into detail. You're talking about integrating rather than segregating. In other words, trying to link things together rather than keep them apart. So in your zone system, you're trying to link things together so that, and an example is you grow your say you've got something like Tagastasti, which chickens will eat if they're hungry. You might grow that as a nitrogen fixer for the vegetables in the vegetable patch, and you might have the chickens beside it so that you chuck it over the wall into the chickens, for example. Make sure you have diversity. A monoculture, I don't have to say it, you know yourselves the danger of monoculture when it comes to pest and disease. Use edges and value the marginal. So create as many edges as you can between different systems. If you're building a pond, don't just have a really circular pond. Make it with wobbly edges, because that's where the life is going to be. That's where you're going to find the frog spawn. You're not going to find it out in the middle of the pond. You're going to find it at the edges. That's where you're going to get your insects. That's where everything's going to happen. It happens at the edges. Same in an orchard. You'll find at the edges where you've got your tree line or something where it boundaries onto something else. That's where the diversity is. And creatively use and respond to change. Classic example at the moment, we're going clearly, well, in my opinion, we're going from a temperate climate in Auckland to a subtropical climate in Auckland. We're starting to see a monsoon type pattern coming in with the rains, getting heavy rains, short, sharp rain, and then periods of drought. So we need to respond to that somehow. So we need to create ways to store the water when it's available, to use it when it's not available. Never used to have to, I suspect 20 years ago, that certainly wasn't as relevant as it is now. So use and respond to change. Recognize the change is there and respond to it. Now, I'll give you some examples of permaculture principles. I tried to think something that will be relevant. You may have an orchard, you may have codling moth on your apples. And I can speak from experience here. We had, when we moved onto the house, we had about 80% of our apple crop had holes in it. We had a very big codling moth problem. And we did our research and we did what we could, including putting a flock of chickens into the orchard. Now, the chickens are well, there's many uses for chickens in permaculture. You know, they give you eggs, they give you food, you can eat them, they scratch the ground, they remove the grubs, and so on and so on and so on. But the example I want to show you is the codling moth example. You know, you may be aware of the cycle in the codling moth. if you start with the mating, the male and the female mate, they lay an egg on a leaf or on a flower. The fruit forms, the egg hatches, and the larvae burrows into the fruit. It sits there, it gets bigger and bigger, and then it makes its way out of the fruit, munching its way out. Then it climbs up the branch and goes down the tree its aim is to get into the soil or to get into a dark area where it can rest and then go through its pupae stage and become another adult. So first of all, the first thing we did was to put corrugated cardboard around the tree, so that when the grub ended up in the corrugated cardboard, we'd strip it off and burn it. That was one thing that helped. But the other thing that would help was with the chickens in the orchard, they used to scrab around and they would see the bugs coming down. So at the end of in the autumn, we used to make sure we mowed around the base of the tree, and we'd feed the chickens around the base of the tree. So they get used to scratching and everything else around the base of the trees. And in doing so, they'd eat the grain that we'd given them, but they'd also eat the larvae that were there and scratch them through, which then you've broken that cycle. And then again in spring, when it was the emerging time for as the sun heats up the soil, the larvae get the signal, time to go out and find your life partner. I say life partner, and it is only a one day they live, but never mind. So you get that, and or at least the females. And we'd feed the chickens again at the base of the tree, so they do their scratching around, eat the grain, and gather the emerging bugs. So we tried to break the cycle that way, and within 2 years, we'd gone from a 10% good fruit, 90 or 80, 20% good fruit, 80% rotten fruit, to the other way around. We do 20% good fruit, rotten fruit, and 80% good fruit. In other words, we completely, by breaking that cycle, and once you've broken the cycle, then you can actually, it's a very simple matter to keep it going. So we cut the trees in the spring, we feed them around the bottom of the trees, and we do that again in the autumn. And in doing so, we keep that. So that's one example of observing, of understanding the natural cycle of the codlin moth and putting something in place to make it work. Now, another example of no waste. I came across this quote somewhere. I think it's lovely. It's pretty amazing that our society has reached a point where the effort necessary to extract oil from the ground, ship it to a refinery, turn it into a plastic, shape it, truck it to a store, buy it, and bring it home is considered to be less effort than what it takes just to wash a spoon when you're done with it. I really like that. I can't hear you laughing, but I take it that you're all laughing your heads off. But I think it's a bit of a bit of a comment on the way things I like to think were, but because I know things are changing. So yeah, I won't go into, as I say, I've given you some examples of all you can see them there. You're going to get a copy of these slides if you want, so you'll be able to read them at your own. So each of the principles, I go into a bit more detail there. So in summary, permaculture uses knowledge of natural processes gained through observation to provide long-term solutions for today's problems. It mirrors what the indigenous tribes have done for thousands of years, and they've survived thousands of years doing it that way. It mirrors a lot of the ways they used to work with nature to create the environment which allowed them to sustain it and perpetuate their way of life. So can permaculture save the world? I don't think so. It's not a silver bullet, but it can be together with a lot of other things. I think it can certainly combine with them to give us a better chance for the future. So combined with technological advancements and solar panels and different fuel mechanisms, so on, changes to policy, probably one of the greatest things we need to do is to change our policy. Infrastructure in this country is getting a lot of attention at the moment. But the lack of infrastructure is probably getting a greater amount of attention. The fact that everything is being put in place with a very short-term, usually a political viewpoint behind it. And the third thing that combined permaculture ethics and principles combined with a shift in consumer behavior. And that's slowly happening. When Bill Mollison started off back in the 1970s, 80s with these PDCs, it was more of an ecological lesson. But we take that for granted now. And we can do a lot more with the knowledge we have to create a more sustainable future. So yeah, I've tried to give you a bit of a practical how to do it bit and a bit of a theory or background as to why we're doing it that way. Thank you.